And then I want to talk about some, again, my last one is some overlap between the conversation today and some of the stuff that we've been thinking about. So challenges in this work, of course, are it's the third shift. Organizing is always the third shift, at least the third shift after your paid work, after whatever, you know, domestic, household, family, or commitments that you have. So I think that we have to know that it's the third and the fourth shift and have that commitment. Right? I think it makes that question of, you know, the revolution might not be funded, but and people are broke. But how do we leverage resources? How do we think about that kind of resources? I also think that it's important to pay attention to co-optation and assimilation, or the politics of respectability, as I like to call it, right? Because often when systems or when people in power recognize a problem, what they want to do is, you know, cherry pick the people who are going to be able to mask over that problem in the most effective way. So really thinking about the work that we do and having a rigorous politics to leave no one behind, and what our goals are, and being clear about our politics, so that when the state or corporations or whoever comes along, it really pushes the co-optation, like, okay, how do we resist that, even when we do need the cash, right? So I think that's kind of like a back and forth. I think that the work is really messy. I mean, I'm outlining it kind of neatly today, but I feel like, you know, it's not a clean. I think organizing work is never clean. It's not linear. I also think that it's much, you know, for those of us in university spaces or professional spaces, it's much easier to be accountable to our professions than it is to be accountable to movements, right? Because at the end of the day, it pays our rent, right? So I think that really rethinking that politics of accountability is a challenge, but I think it's important. I also think that this is kind of a thread throughout the conversation today. It's sort of this willingness to be kind of uncomfortable, uncollegial. I think it wears you down, right? I think that, you know, I often use the term like the lefty loonies, right? Because you can find the lefty loonies when you're at a meeting, who are the crazy people who are advocating prison abolition, for example, like me, right? And I think that it can be really wearing. So I think people were talking about the challenges in identifying as a feminist, the pushback. But I think that's where finding your community is really key, and people who are going to sustain you. But I think justice work, pushing back, working for economic justice, working for racial justice, working for gender justice in this moment means that you're, you know, calling out unequal sets of power relationships. And I think that it's really it's going to be uncomfortable work. I think the expectation that it's all going to be fun and really supportive is not realistic. So I think that thinking about how we're going to take care of ourselves, and I was thinking today, I was like yawning and back with Nick, feeling a little tired. I go to these justice movement meetings where they have like a yoga room, you know, they have like, you know, a lot of self-care, and I feel like there's a real big commitment to taking care of the bodies that we live in the world, and I think that's important. So this were just some of the challenges: money, the third shift, co-optation, messiness, and the fact that you're doing pushback work. So now I just want to close with talking a little bit about some of the overlaps between the discussions today, gaming and gender, and some of the work that I'm doing. I think the first one is, again, the possibilities for these politics of feminist solidarity. You know, rather than seeing the manifestations of gender and sexual violence as isolating, as impacting an isolated community, what do we gain by linking these experiences of gender, sexual, racial, and other forms of violence to wider feminist movements? So I think that's a really interesting question for me. Like, and how would we do that work? How can we link that up? And I think it's an important one. Another question that comes up for me is, what are the conditions for those of us in the room that lead us to be surprised about the persistence of gender and sexual violences in any sphere in particular, in the spheres? Another thing that I've been thinking a little bit about is, and we've talked a bit about today, is how the problem is defined for us. And I think that one of the ways, one of the values of thinking through feminist and other social movement history is how the state, government, systems of power structures often respond to our critiques with an additive model. Right? Like, oh, we're just going to add, you just add women, we'll just add brown people, we'll do will have an additive structure, rather than what we're asking for, which is often the redistribution of power, right? We don't want just recognition, we want redistribution. So I think I'm very interested in these questions about reform, which are about reform tensions, short-term reforms, longer-term structural changes. How do we do this? And how do we not get co-opted? And how do we not get assimilated? And I'm also interested in the question, which didn't come up today, so it might just only be a question for me, but of gender and sexual violences in gaming and the sort of the older histories of censorship debates sort of in feminist spheres, right? I think that's an interesting question for me, because I think that one of the, I'm fairly critical of that turn towards, we want to have censorship, and I was really happy that a couple of people sort of flagged that that's not what we're looking for. But I think that often when harm happens, and harm happens to vulnerable communities, that's the Builds and Powers response. We should engage censorship, or we should shut down conversations. So I'm very critical of that in the work that I do, because I often think that those state responses or corporate responses end up harming people, queers, right, get caught up in censorship laws, right, instead of actually being a little bit toward power. I'm also excited about these discussions about these great autonomous spaces, or what I see as kind of autonomous spaces, the PMS clan, the bento miso people in the back. It just sounded really interesting. I think that if we think about histories of social movements, the work of autonomous or separatist communities, right, whether it's ACT UP or the work of factions of the civil rights movement or Seneca Falls, people. Yes, Erica. Whoa. I think that those autonomous separatist collectives offer these temporal possibilities that are really interesting and exciting for me in the work that I do, non-gaming work, and so I'm interested to see that cropping up here, and I think that's a really powerful. Comes back to that the community we keep, right, and these kind of cultures of resistance, communities of resistance is really important. And I'm also just interested to know what kind of mechanisms are there already in place. These ideas about political education. How do we politically educate new members who are interested in these topics? What are the mechanisms that we have? There was some discussion about setting up a journal. How do we set up things that aren't professionalizing and sort of policing and setting norms? How do we have political education practices, both internally but also externally? I think that's really important. And then the last sort of set of questions that I'll end with are, I'm really interested in somebody who does a lot of work on the intersections of anti-violence movements and anti-prison movements. These questions about community accountability. So when harm happens, how instead of having, I love the fact that when people reported that the moderators, nobody calls the moderator because they don't actually do anything. Well, no one calls the police anymore because they don't actually do anything either. So how do we develop ways in our communities to respond to harm and violence that are actually effective? So I think that engaging bystanders and developing models of community accountability are what lots of projects and small, local, block by block, community by community projects are doing across the United States and parts of Canada in these attempts to really transform communities. So, when Suzanne and Jen asked me to do this, I was like, I just don't think I can be very helpful, right? But I'm hoping that just by laying out some of these intersections or these overlaps between some of the work that I do and I'm committed to can be helpful to this community as you think about sort of sector building or sector consolidation. Thank you. Questions?
Okay, some questions.
I think it's all that stands between me and the drink, or the drink.
Yeah, I know, that's
no questions. Yes.
Really long, slow question.
Okay.
I was really curious because it seems to me that one of the most exciting things about the internet is how it's being used to support sort of micro local initiatives. So, for example, getting local communities to take care of their street directly and to be responsible for sort of firefighters. Just doing that sort of peer-to-peer connection on a very micro level.
Mm-hmm.
How much do you work with social network and online tools to support your practice, and how do you blend that between the sort of real world activities?
Yeah, I feel like for me, a lot of the work that I do is really local, but requires a national or an international apparatus to support it, and everything from conference calls to Facebook groups, right? That's, I don't know if I answered your question. That kind of international linkage wouldn't be possible without some of the tools without those tools. And I also think that there's great the folks in Chiapas. I think there's really interesting examples of autonomous groups globally that are using. But you're asking me, what do I do? I think that because of the majority of the work that I do in Chicago is with really, poor communities. Like, we tried to make all of our materials, like, we create paper zines, we make those downloadable, right, and those are circulatable. So that kind of thing, like trying to DIY, low-tech, user-friendly, stuff like that. So we haven't been as, I think that for the external political education, we've tried to create, to archive that work electronically and to use it, to use that. That's great.
My question is actually for Dr. Griffiths. You were talking about how your work that you're going to be working on has to do with policy making and levels of government.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you explore one level of government, like the federal level, state level. Do you explore all levels of government, or because you've got municipal, state?
Yeah. Well, if you ask the question, how does a change in educational policy about homework turn up as kitchen table work for parents and children at home? Then the question is, how does it get from there, there's people sitting around up there somewhere, to the place where it's at the kitchen table and parents and children are sitting around trying to figure out how to handle this thing called homework, which we all know is such fun. And, so in order to understand how policy that's changed here affects what's going on here, you actually have to go through all the levels. So in the institution of ethnography, what you do is you start with something that's actually going on. Parents and children sitting down at the table where the parents are tearing out their hair and the children are sulking and are saying, I didn't want to do it anyway. And then you figure out, how did it get from the teacher? What's going on with the teacher that it comes home? What's going on with the school that it has this policy? What's going on with the board? The board says 20 minutes for grade 1 or grade 2 or whatever they say. And then you sort of start following it through in order to figure out how it actually happens that it gets from one place to another. Because we never know how it gets from one place to another. So another place that Dorothy and I are putting this book together that includes talk about how nurses are having to teach nursing students differently because the testing that they have to do is now set up nationally. Right? So this test that's organized nationally appears in the nurses' teaching area, and like, how does it get from there to there, and what happens to the work of teaching usually women to be nurses? The issue of how somebody working in Kyrgyzstan in a NGO, non-government agency, NGA, non-government organization, whatever, has how they have to fill out certain forms in order to do the reporting that allows them to get the money. But the work on the ground doesn't quite fit into the form. So how do they make that connection? And where's the form coming from? Well, it comes from Paris. Right? So there's a very interesting set of social relations that organize the work of people on the front line. But then the question is, because then you see, you cannot assume that what you're experiencing in this moment of your lives is something that simply is there because it's there. It's all been organized.